Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining in. We are here today with Richard. Please introduce yourself to our audience.
Thanks, Julia. Hello, everybody. My name is Richard Storey, and I guess by way of introduction, I'm a risk and compliance professional. I've got over 15 years of experience in anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing in particular. And currently, I'm an independent consultant and consulting to entities that are regulated by AUSTRAC under the AML CTF Act here in Australia. Prior to that, my most recent role was as General Manager for Enterprise Risk and Financial Crime Risk at Tabcorp, where I was also the AML Co or Money Laundering Reporting Officer. I spent heaps of years as well, many years, developing AML CTF risk management data, technology and processes. And that's included collaboration on KYC utilities and managed services with regulators here and also in Asia. So in particular, the MAS in Singapore, the Monetary Authority there, and the HKMA, so the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, as well as AUSTRAC here in Australia. So a lot of time spent with regulators, a lot of time spent with fellow chief risk officers, AML COs, money laundering reporting officers. And I think also one of the things I've really enjoyed is working with the financial crime operations teams across a multitude of different reporting entities. So getting to roll the sleeves up and get involved in the operationalising of the AML CTF policies and programs has been a really satisfying part of my career to date. I've really enjoyed that. And it's given me that perspective that I think regulators also appreciate, is that perspective of how do we make these legislation and regulations work in real life so as to try and prevent money laundering or the financing of terrorism or the financing of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I think that probably gives a fairly thorough sort of introduction, doesn't it?
No, it was great. Thanks. How interesting about your international experience. Can you tell us about what you think are some difference with Singapore and Hong Kong and Australia?
Oh, yeah, there's heaps of differences, and there's a lot of similarities as well. I mean, Singapore is really interesting because it's such a well-defined sort of city-state. Really, they've got the ability to have quite prescriptive regulations and that sort of sit around obligations and legislation in Singapore. So really, the government can say, "Thou shalt do this," and industry and individuals pretty much have to follow line. And so they've got very strong identification processes there. So individuals, have, like an American Social Security number, they have a citizenship number. Entities have to have the same thing. They have to have an identification number, and it's a lot more strongly sort of regulated and administered than, for instance, an ABN, so an Australian business number here in Australia, or similar sort of number in New Zealand, where every entity has one, but it doesn't really tell an outsider much about the entity to issue that number or to use that number. Whereas in Singapore, there's very specific details around what is involved behind that identification number for individuals and businesses. So that makes much of the MLTF processes, I think, a lot more rigorous and a lot more effective in many ways. Hong Kong is probably more, it's changing a lot since I was working up there. I mean, I was working in 2014, 15, 16, 17 in Hong Kong with Hong Kong HKMA around a managed service KYC utility for corporate institutional banks to help them provide a higher level of client due diligence on an ongoing basis. And so, working with the HKMA on the idea of having Hong Kong, managed service that was supported or at least tacitly endorsed by the regulator, the HKMA. So that's mostly what I was doing up there.
That's very interesting. I think you're touching upon some very important points. For example, I think the frustration that many reporting entities have, certainly in Australia and New Zealand, which are the jurisdiction that I know more, is about continuously verifying people identity, and something more centralized solution will be welcome. Yeah. But it's the difference also in how many people there are in Australia compared to how many people there are in Singapore, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's got something to do with that. I think, there's also this weird sort of cultural issue in Australia. There was many years ago, probably well before you were born, Julia. There was the concept of an Australia card, which was an attempt by the government at the time, decades ago, to have Australian citizens have like a social security number, and that was vigorously debated, publicly, and heartily rejected by the majority of people with a voice in Australia at the time, anyway. So yeah, I think it's Australia has got some sort of issues with that revealing of identities and revealing of information, and so that sanctity of privacy is a big deal in Australia. We're seeing that with changes in the Privacy Act now that can provide some issues when trying to prevent money laundering. When you're trying to understand ultimate beneficial owners in Australia, when you're trying to understand sources of wealth and sources of funds. Some of the questions that you need to ask, the people you need to talk to, they can actually, sort of invoke Privacy Act provisions that can shield them from revealing the details that you might be wanting to clarify. So I think Australia is very different like that, and I think it would be lovely to have, ASIC sort of regulate a rigorous identification, for ultimate beneficial owners and directors. But I think we're quite a long way from that, where we are now here in Australia.
And everybody can focus on more high-risk things to consider. But talking about Australia, talking about reforms, is on everybody's mind the AML CTF amendment bill that passed at the end of the past year. And since you've been working in AML in Australia for a while, I wanted to see if there was something that you would have liked the bill to cover, the act to cover, that it didn't happen. If you had like a wish list of things to happen, that what did you think when you read the final?
Look, it's I think the Amendment Act is great in many regards. It is a massive improvement and a step forward for Australia, primarily in the fact that it includes the Tranche 2 entities. It does bring in these businesses that have been prone to leverage by bad actors for the laundering of money. And, it's been a matter of public debate, so the real estate agents, accountants, lawyers, those sorts of corporate services providers that, haven't had any obligation to report suspicious matters or to, really have thorough client due diligence or to identify the source of wealth or source of funds for, high value asset acquisitions that they might make in Australia. So bringing those entities into regulated space along with others that are all together considered Tranche 2 entities, I think that's a huge step forward. And in terms of what I wish was in there that we don't have in there, well, there really isn't much that they haven't covered, to be honest. I think there's some we've still got a way to go in terms of fine tuning how that new act, how the rules are going to help us understand how that act should be interpreted and operationalised. So really it hinges around the rules that are coming from AUSTRAC, and then in addition to those rules, the guidance that AUSTRAC has promised to deliver to the industry as well. So I think there's probably only one sort of top of mind thing that I wish for, and that I think is still coming. And that's one of the key changes in the Act is around the tipping off provisions. So Section 123 of the old Act, the tipping off provisions prevented us from sharing with anybody any of the details that might be in a suspicious matter report that we would submit to AUSTRAC. And the problem with that was that in a large organisation with complex sort of structure, effectively what that meant was that by submitting an SMR on behalf of one of the reporting entities in the group of my company, for instance, by submitting that SMR, or even by looking at that SMR, I should say, the contents thereof, I was effectively tipping myself off because I was employed by a different entity to the reporting entity. So that was quite ridiculous. And what that meant is that, many entities had to go to AUSTRAC and ask for an exemption from Section 123 of the Act so that we weren't tipping ourselves off as we made every report. So that's changed and that's been great. What I did want to see was more of a focus on harm prevention in that section of the Act. And by that I mean, it has taken the step of moving to really be about not revealing information that would be in an SMR if it's likely to prejudice an investigation. So that's a great focus. So it means that, we can share information amongst ourselves in a reporting entity, as long as the intent is that we are obviously trying to prevent money laundering, terrorism financing and proliferation financing. But as long as the sharing of that information isn't likely to ruin or prejudice an investigation now or in the future. So that's a great focus change. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't allow private to private reporting entity sharing as yet. So there is provision for that. Because of that focus on harm prevention, we could theoretically be allowed to share, say, between one entity and another that are outside, that are basically two separate organisations. So, you think of Star and Crown casinos, they could potentially share as long as they're not sharing, they're not likely to be prejudicing an investigation in the future or currently. So what we need now, in order to really clarify that would be allowed, is clarity in the rules. And then we're also going to need regulations from the Attorney General's Department. So those regulations for the Attorney General Department, they're still not, in draft, they're still not with us. That's something I really wish, basically could have been baked into the Act potentially. And if not the Act, then in the rules. But we'll have to wait for the Attorney General's Department to come forward with their thoughts on that one. But that's probably the biggest one for me. And there's a lot of stuff in the Act that, there's a lot of pages in the Act that we're still going to go through. There's still literally going to be hundreds of pages of guidance from AUSTRAC. There's a lot of work to do to see how it will shake out for the Tranche 1 entities. It's a little clearer for the Tranche 2 entities, bringing them into the program now.
I think that's a very interesting point that you're making about the tipping off and the information sharing. And I think that a lot of problems in the anti-money laundering effort is information sharing, and how I call we as in the side of we are working in the anti-money laundering, and we have difficulties getting information from AUSTRAC sometimes. A lot of reporting entities complain that they don't have feedback on their suspicious matter reports, or how they progress, what happens, if there is anything to be known. And definitely that peer-to-peer in the private sector information sharing, that in a way mimic what will be FIU information sharing in different jurisdictions, but we don't have that. And criminals always share information freely with no rules, and on our side, we don't do that.
We have rules, we have obligations. That's right. Yeah. I think you're right.
And as you were talking about Tranche 2, which is a monumental change, there's going to be a lot to do for a lot of people. And I wonder, what do you think about AUSTRAC capacity to deal with Tranche 2?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting point. It's been one of debate for quite a while now, because, obviously AUSTRAC have been in the past, regulating 15,000 to 17,000 reporting entities. And now with Tranche 2, there's another 95,000 to 100,000 extra entities coming on board. So that is obviously a huge uplift in just processing the data potentially from TTRs and SMRs. But, more importantly, looking at all those annual compliance reports, because every one of those entities needs to fill out the ACR or annual compliance report. So all of those sorts of basic steps require an uplift in capacity at AUSTRAC. And they've been aware of that, obviously, for some years now, and they've been recruiting. So they have been building. They've had increases in budget size from the federal government in order to do so, and they've been hiring more people. But I think more importantly and more intelligently, AUSTRAC really now has strongly focused on uplifting their data analytics capability. So increasing their use of technology and, hiring more people in that data and analytics space so that they can actually glean more information from all of this new data. In addition to that, they're also taking another smart approach, which is to say that with the Tranche 2 entities coming on board, they are talking about issuing template AML programs for those entities. So, if your entity is a standard, small real estate agency with, X number of employees, it might be less than 5, and with, less than X number of transactions per annum, then you may well fit quite neatly into one of the template AML CTF programs that AUSTRAC is promising to issue as part of their guidance that's coming out. prior to those entities having to be regulated and therefore obliged to have an AML program. So that's, I think, actually a really very smart way for AUSTRAC to move forward. They're very much against, templates just being squeezed over an entity of any size, shape, nature, or complexity. But what they are doing is saying, look, if your entity, if your business fits these parameters, then this template is a close fit for your business. You obviously then need to assess each step of the way and make sure that you fine tune it for yourself. But that way, it does mean that those entities are kind of going to have an AUSTRAC endorsed AML program. So that raises a question: how much regulating will those smaller entities really need? And the answer may well be very little. Other than things like the annual compliance report, the obligations for reporting transactions of a certain size, the obligations for reporting SMRs. Other than that, they may well, not need a lot of heavy lifting from AUSTRAC once these templates are delivered. It will remain to be seen, how detailed those sort of descriptions, if you like, those parameters are, and how well they fit most of them. But AUSTRAC has had a lot of time and spent a lot of time and energy talking to those industries and understanding their businesses better. So I think AUSTRAC are pretty well prepared and well positioned to take on board this new sort of volume of reporting entities.
I think that I was in New Zealand when New Zealand moved to Tranche 2, and the Department of Internal Affairs, which is the organ that oversees lawyers, accountants, real estate agents in New Zealand, it didn't produce templates. It gave a lot of guidance, but it didn't produce a template per se. And what happened is that vacuum meant that someone else produced templates. And I believe the Law Society, the New Zealand Law Society, produced templates. I also think some accounting body produced templates, but I don't see those ones as often. And the danger with that is that someone else, the danger of not producing a template when you roll out a legislation to such a big amount of, such big numbers of businesses, is that someone else might do it. And the risk with that is that AUSTRAC might not be happy with what it's
with what they do. Yeah, exactly.
So
and
if you can, and if you can maintain that control, and I think that's what AUSTRAC wants to do, so that's good. And just to say that we saw that in New Zealand, that's eventually someone else did it because the need is there.
Yeah, I think AUSTRAC's been pretty lucky in that they've been able to look at New Zealand, and New Zealand was way ahead of us. So New Zealand's had that Tranche 2, those two Tranche 2 entities in the regime now for many years, and so there's been many lessons learned along the way. So AUSTRAC's had the benefit of talking to practitioners like yourself and their fellow regulators over in New Zealand to understand well, what would you do differently? And they talk. Dan Mossop I think spoke at the Financial Integrity Hub conference last week, and he talked about that collaboration that had been going on with other regulators, looking at how they would like to have done the same thing differently. And so that puts them in that great position where they really have been able to prepare themselves very well for the Tranche 2 entities coming on board. And it has been coming for a long time, hasn't it? 2006 is when the Act was first sort of introduced. So it's been a while. And many in Australia called it a Tranche too far and never thought we'd make it. But with the impending FATF mutual evaluation, I think the Australian government realised that they had to do something and do something quickly. So AUSTRAC's had plenty of time to get ready for it, and they've done a good job, I think. And obviously it remains to be seen. But their intent is to issue further or do further consultation on the rules. So we should get the final draft of the rules. And talking about having that finalisation around about August, so another couple of months, and they've got until, I think we've all got until the 24th of June to submit views of the current draft rules. And then I think by October of this year, they will issue core guidance. That's the guidance to more of the Tranche 1 entities. And then there'll be a phase of looking at Tranche 2 sector-specific guidance. And so I think that's October, November, possibly into December probably. And then they'll have that guidance issued, I think, by the end of the year for the Tranche 2 sector-specific guidance. So, I think that the view is from AUSTRAC that the guidance will come out giving Tranche 1 6 months, by the 31st of March 2026, and then giving Tranche 2 6 months, so that it will run from December 25 through to July 1, 2026, when they get into the regime.
It's coming so quickly. Unfortunately, for some, I mean, it's time flies when you have fun with anti-money laundering. We talked a lot about what AUSTRAC learned, or the conversation that AUSTRAC had with other regulators, and I wonder from your experience what Tranche 2 entities can learn from Tranche 1 entities to be prepared.
A lot. Yeah, I think, there's certainly some Tranche 1 entities that could really, stand as sanitary lessons for the Tranche 2 entities. Obviously the entities that have been through enforcement, including one of those that I used to work for. So those entities, so for the Tranche 2 entities, lessons to be learned would be to review those enforcements. So the statements of claim, the concise but also the detailed statements are well worth reviewing for those Tranche 2 entities to get an understanding, the recent ones in particular, those enforcement sort of notices as well, to get an understanding of the regulatory posture from AUSTRAC. Because, as important as obviously the Act and the rules and the guidance is, we also need to understand AUSTRAC's intent and AUSTRAC's way of regulating. So I think Tranche 2 entities could learn from Tranche 1 entities what's happening right now. How has AUSTRAC's regulatory posture changed in the last 2 or 3 years? Because it has. It's changed quite significantly. So talking to Tranche 1 entities and talking to consultants like yourself, Julia, that have been working with those Tranche 1 entities, that would be something that I think Tranche 2 entities should learn. And I think a key learning also is not to be complacent. The Tranche 1 entities in Australia were incredibly complacent. I've been, as I mentioned, over 15 years in this industry. And for much of that time, a lot of the Tranche 1 entities were sort of saying, oh, no, we'll be right, mate. We're okay. We've got enough of an idea. We know who our customers are. It's all good. And it really took some pretty strong regulatory enforcement action from AUSTRAC to wake them up. So Tranche 2, don't be complacent. Take this very seriously. Get to understand the Act, the rules, and your sector-specific guidance. Observe it and I guess monitor what comes up on the AUSTRAC website. And that's a very key piece of guidance right there, because they will publish their in-brief newsletter. They will also publish their enforcement actions, but they publish a lot more on their regulatory posture and intent. So I think that Tranche 1 entities could learn to do that. The better Tranche 1 entities have done it as well. And I think another really key point is Tranche 1 entities have been a little bit complacent with their enterprise-wide risk assessments, I think, as a general rule. I mean, that's a massive generalisation. There's 15 or 17,000 of them at any given time, so some of them are really very good at their EWRAs, but many have been a little bit complacent. And I think the AML program going forward under the new Act, it does actually have the enterprise-wide risk assessment as part of the AML program. It wasn't before, it is now. So Tranche 2 entities could learn from Tranche 1 entities that the importance of that, as we call it, ERA, Enterprise Risk Assessment, is really the foundation for your AML CTF program. You really need to be able to identify, assess the MLTF, PF risks that your business faces. So it really is about, first of all, understanding the inherent risks in your business, and then being able to say, okay, well, how are we going to manage and mitigate these risks? And really, I think that's a key learning for the Tranche 2 entities, is focus on that risk assessment.
Yeah, there's all good points. I would like to add getting a independent review early. I think the current time frame is 3 years by memory, or at least this is what it's I remember. But I always say that it's a deadline. It not necessarily is a suggestion. You can have it earlier. You have to have it within the time frame, but you can have it after a year if you want. And the reason for that is that it's very easy to fall into complacence, like you're saying, Richard, and falling into the business as usual every day. That's how we do things, and never stopping and thinking how we should do things. And then having an external person might give you that fresh set of fresh eye and say, we should do this, we should do that.
I think that's a really good point. And even if you don't do a full, you don't need to do a full independent review necessarily for quite a big and complex organisation. You can do a diagnostic review. I think tranche one entities in the past also were a little bit hesitant because they sort of thought, well, if I get an independent review done or if I get consultants in too early, they might find big gaps that we're not aware of. And once I get them to do that, then AUSTRAC can actually access that information. They can ask me to share it. And so AUSTRAC can see that we've been, non-compliant, for instance, or we've had multiple breaches, and then they can fine us. So I think, I think that made some tranche one entities a little gun shy on the independent reviews. Obviously, then there's also the cost. But, there is, you can also have a legal team, go through and do a diagnostic and try and identify areas where you're weak. And you can do get an external law firm to do it, and that can be done under privilege. So that is worthwhile considering as well. There are other ways of getting help that don't necessarily sort of give you that feeling that you're perhaps self-incriminating. I've sort of got that sense from clients in the past that they were a bit too worried about that when they should be focused on how do we just get better. Because, AUSTRAC's intent is to help the industry prevent money laundering and prevent the underlying crime that really is what ruins society and causes great harm to communities. So that's really what they're after. They're not necessarily just after, they don't necessarily just want to find, reporting entities. They just want to improve our defences against money laundering and terrorism financing and proliferation financing. So do get the advice. If you're really worried about it, get a lawyer, get your legal team to provide some advice under privilege. But nonetheless, get it done. And I think you're right. Get it done more often than every 3 years. I think every 3 years is a bit too long in the tooth. Most AML programs will have, for organisations that do face significant risk, their programs will have provision for more regular independent reviews than every 3 years. It's more likely to be every 2 years at least, and some every year. So I think frequent attention to the AML program from an external advisor is a really good practice to get into.
Let's not call it independent review. Let's call it assurance. Let's do some assurance. So some
I call it sort of a diagnostic sort of review.
Diagnostic,
as well. You can do that, and you can do diagnostic review, desk based, or you can do a really thorough, sort of more operational review as well. And maybe you could stagger those in different years. Start off with the desk-based diagnostic that's looking more at the program, documentation and policies, and then move into the operational review perhaps the following year. That staggers things like costs, but also, you've got to bear in mind that there is an impost on the operations of the organisation in order to facilitate a proper review, thorough review. So they've got to stop their BAU and they've got to provide information to the reviewer. They've got to answer questions. There's a lot of back and forth. It sucks up a lot of time. So, that's another reason why these things get put off, because the urgency of business, demands, if you will, sort of take precedence over, what might be considered to be a nice to have diagnostic, prior to that 3-year sort of period.
We have covered a lot of ground, Richard. Is there anything else that you want to add as a closing remark or something that we didn't cover?
Look, I think you're right. I feel like I've done a lot of talking. I think perhaps I should just shut up. Look, I think there's, what I would say is that I think, AUSTRAC is doing a great job of consulting with industry and is very strongly focused on preventing that, that basic economic harm that comes from the crimes that underlie money laundering. So, I think bearing that in mind, bearing in mind the reason why we all do this, it's not about just compliance and, making sure we tick a box and we don't get fined by the regulator. It's actually about preventing crime. So I think it's really important for, particularly, I guess, the tranche 2 and the newer reporting entities to really understand that this is not about just creating a regulatory impulse. It's actually about preventing crime and preventing money laundering that comes after the crime.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you, Julia. Thanks very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.